So in this section, we're going to talk about who Charles Darwin was and how he got to the point where he developed this theory of evolution by natural selection. He was a younger son of what we call the landed gentry. His father was very well off. They were not fabulously wealthy, but they were pretty rich. But he was the younger son, and so he did not expect to actually inherit anything. By tradition, everything would go to his oldest brother. And so the problem with younger sons is, you got to find them some way to earn their keep. So one of the traditional things was medical school. His brother went to medical school. Remember that Charles's grandfather was a physician. And so when his brother was sent to medical school in Edinburgh, which was the finest medical school in the day, they sent Charles along. And Erasmus, his brother, did fine. And Charles hated medical school. He just absolutely hated it. This actually speaks fairly well to his character. Medical school at the time, this was before the use and really discovery of anesthesia. And so surgeries were done in a literal surgical theater. It's still called a surgical theater, but it was then an open theater with lots of people watching, and the patient largely without anesthetic, except, maybe a bunch of gin. And so it was a dreadful experience. Also, this was before really understanding of preservatives for preserving, say, cadavers. And so when they were learning on cadavers, there was a lot of rotting smells. Anyway, he hated medical school. He dropped out. He actually spent most of his time with others who were interested in the natural world, learning natural history, learning about organisms, learning about how to look at the natural world. He learned taxidermy from a man who had been enslaved, who had bought his freedom. And eventually the whole family realized that Charles was not going to make it as a doctor. And so he dropped out, and he was sent to Cambridge University to study to be a parson, or a religious person. And he really was not interested in that at all. He wanted to, study the natural world. He spent his time riding horses. He started collecting beetles. He hung out with a lot of other natural philosophers, and started studying natural history, started studying the natural world. And he actually ended up reading works by a lot of people who argued for what we now call the scientific method, which is inductive reasoning, which is seeing what facts are present in the world and drawing conclusions from that. And he had also read at this time a book by Alexander Humboldt, a personal narrative of travels to the equinoctial regions of America. Alexander Humboldt had traveled widely in South America, in the areas around the equator. And Darwin became really obsessed with literally following in Humboldt's footsteps. If you would like to learn about Humboldt, this book, The Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf, is an amazing, just such a great read, talking about Alexander Humboldt's travels, what he learned, what he saw, how that affected him politically and emotionally. He did become somewhat of a revolutionary figure and became very, very good friends with Simón de Bolívar, who led a revolution against Spanish colonial rule. And he was an amazing figure. He was also a very, very important naturalist, and there are a number of organisms today that are named the Humboldt whatever because they were first described by Humboldt. Anyway, Charles Darwin became obsessed with Humboldt and really wanted to follow in his footsteps, go the places where he had gone. And he studied geology as well as plants and animals so that he could understand the geology of the places that he went, because Humboldt said that that was important. So Darwin did end up graduating from Cambridge. He was recommended afterward as a naturalist to accompany a captain on this voyage on a ship called the Beagle that was supposed to spend 2 years mapping the coasts of South America. And they were going to stop in the Canary Islands, which is one of the places that Humboldt had gone. So Darwin was really excited about this. Notice he is not given a parsonage and a life as a minister. That was just never going to happen. And at this point in his life, Darwin was really kind of wondering, like, what am I going to do with myself? Because the traditional professional and life paths for him just weren't working out. So he got this idea, he got this chance to be a naturalist, and he's like, cool. The problem was somebody had to pay for it. And so he asked his father. His father was like, no fucking way, not doing that. Some friends finally convinced his father, you should let Charles do this. He's not going to be a parson. Just let him do this. And so Dad paid for Charles's trip. Charles was also able to negotiate that he maintained ownership of all of the specimens that he collected during the voyage. So they didn't belong to the ship or the captain or the crown. They belonged to Darwin. And if you're thinking, wow, that seems like a huge source of wealth, you're right. So one of the things I want you to understand about Darwin's life is that the fact that he came from money made a lot of this possible. Never discount that Charles Darwin was a white man, upper middle class, living in England. He had all the resources. And yes, that made his path much easier. And that's vitally important because he didn't have a magic, unique brain that came up with something no one else could have come up with. He had the resources in place and a unique enough brain to come up with what he came up with. While they were on the trip, the captain of the Beagle gave Darwin a copy of another book that was very important in his thinking called Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. And Lyell was one of the first people to argue that the Earth itself changed geologically, and that these slow, gradual movements created mountains and valleys and moved rocks and things like that. He also argued that the Earth was millions of years old, which was older than anyone else was arguing at the time. Everybody else was like, I don't know, the Earth is maybe a few thousand years old because that's what the Bible says. So Lyell was like, it's got to be older than that. So that was another piece of thinking. All right, so the Beagle. All right, so it was supposed to be a 2-year voyage. It ended up being a 5-year voyage. This is a drawing of the Beagle. And you can see that the voyage started in Plymouth, England, went to Cape Verde. They never actually got to stop at the Canary Islands and see Tenerife, which was a volcano, because there was a yellow fever scare. They then went to South America in what is now Brazil, and went down the coast and around and up to the Galapagos Islands off the the western coast of South America. Notice that the ship is kind of going out to sea and then coming back to land, going out to sea, coming back to land. And a lot of times as the ship is making these treks, Darwin is actually making the trek over land. He spent a lot of time on land. In fact, about a year and a half of the journey, of the voyage, he was on the ship. He spent the rest of the time on land, mostly because he was seasick the entire time. He never got his sea legs. He never got used to being on a boat. So any chance he got to travel overland instead of on the boat, he did that. And he spent his time studying the geology, the plants, the animals, talking to the native people, getting help, gathering specimens, he was trying to determine whether other natural philosophers of the day were correct in their teachings, including trying to figure out whether corals were animals or plants. Cuvier had called them plants, and Darwin's like, I think they're actually animals. Darwin was right on that one. All along the way, he collected specimens and he sent them back to England. So what would happen is ships would meet either in port or out at sea, and if they had mail or shipments that needed to go where the other ship was going, they would exchange those things. And so as they were traveling around, he was able to send letters and specimens back to England. And so we had these long descriptive letters that he sent along with the specimens to talk about where they were found and what kind of specimens they were. He sent all those back to England. So what he doesn't know, he doesn't really understand this until he gets back, is that these specimens are gathering a lot of interest. And his writing, he was a very good writer. His writings are gathering interest and being talked about. By the time he gets back, he's really, really famous. Here's some of the things he saw. He noticed that there were animals in South America that looked absolutely nothing like animals in England. There's nothing like a tapir in England, or a capybara, or a walkery, or a toucan. These things don't exist in England. He's like, how is that possible? Why did God, if God created all this, why did God put certain things in Europe and totally different things in South America? He also noticed that on the islands, there were animals that looked similar to animals on the mainland. So here's a land iguana from South America. Here is a marine iguana from the Galapagos Islands. This one is, I know it looks like Godzilla. It looks really scary. And it is really big. They're a couple feet long. But it's actually, it eats kelp. And yeah, it swims in the water and eats kelp. It's totally harmless. He also noticed that the islands had different environments, and animals on different islands looked different from each other. So on really wet islands, these giant Galapagos tortoises had domed shells. These tortoises are like 5 feet long. So when I say giant, I mean really giant. And that on drier islands, they had these saddlebacks. And you can imagine that the tortoise could actually collect some water there, which could, drain off and then be drunk or something. Or he just didn't need to have, the dome is not advantageous when it's dry. He also noticed that there were similar birds on different islands of the Galapagos. They were similar but different, and that the plant life on those islands were also different. So these are 4 species of finches found in the Galapagos Island, and you can see they're really, really similar looking, but their beaks are very different. And it turns out that those beaks are specialized or adapted to certain food types. So you probably wouldn't be surprised if I told you that this bird eats really big seeds and this bird eats really small seeds. After returning from the Beagle, he was wealthy, he was famous. His father did give him an estate. So he was not only wealthy from his own work, but also wealthy from his inheritance. He had received a lot of praise from scientists. He did publish The Voyage of the Beagle, which is his collected journals and things, in 1839, which was also very, very popular. And it's a very interesting read. I recommend it. And so he became even more famous. He got married, had a ton of kids, never, ever set foot on a boat ever again. I don't think he went out on a pond. He really, the seasickness thing was a big deal. But he wasn't ready. He hadn't put together all of the pieces yet. So one of the things he did was he studied what we now call artificial selection, or human breeding of organisms. What he noticed was, we now know genetically, it was pretty well understood at the time, that all dogs, all domestic dogs, derived from wolves. So they are the result of artificial selection, breeding by humans, of wolves for certain traits. So you can get very large dogs like the Great Dane or very small dogs like the Chihuahua. These are all descended from wolves over a period of a few thousand years, and most dog breeds over a few hundred years. He also studied and, in fact, bred pigeons. Pigeon breeders call them fancy pigeons. And depending on which traits you breed for, you can create a lot of different phenotypes of pigeons. So what he started to think was, if humans in a relatively short period of time can create all of this diversity, then nature, with millions of years to work with, must be able to do even more. He knew, though, that he wasn't in a position to really be respected as a scientist. And so he said, I want a project that will, A, give me experience in scientific thinking and writing, and B, give me respect. He essentially gave himself what we would now call a PhD, which is you take on a big project, you work on it for a few years, you write a big piece about it, and that is your training in being a research scientist. He took on barnacles, and he spent 8 years studying barnacles. These are his sketches of different barnacle species, and you can see that there is tremendous variation in the shape of these little structures that the barnacles make. The barnacles actually live inside this little structure. And he was starting to understand the variation within different species and between species. He spent 20 years altogether doing experiments to understand the natural world and to test his hypotheses. He created a weed garden to understand how long it took for different plants to germinate and how different plants reproduced. He had his children help him monitor the flight paths of bees. They would go out in the garden and he would see a bee and he would say, okay, here comes the bee. And then the child would say, oh, here's the bee. It was a game they played. He tested whether seeds could survive in salt water long enough to travel between continents. And then he would take them out into the garden or into his greenhouse and plant them and see if they would grow. At this point, Darwin is a wealthy man, landed gentry on his own. He has a large household staff, including a butler. And he would have his butler do things like fill a bathtub with salt water and put different seeds, including coconuts, in it to see like how long they would survive. Because he was testing, would seeds survive a journey across the ocean from one part of the earth to another, from a mainland to an island, from one island to another? He got a lot of assistance. And this is another thing I want you to understand. This wasn't Darwin sitting and thinking and learning by himself. He got assistance from his family, his friends, his servants, his neighbors, everyone around him. He was talking with other scientists. He was writing letters to other scientists. He was publishing some articles, what we now would call articles, along the way. He published about barnacles. And so there was a lot of work, and think of it more as a group project led by Darwin than Darwin working all by himself. Okay? Science isn't one single person doing things by themselves. It is always a group project of people working together, putting their data together and talking and thinking together and trying to figure things out. And he worked for 20 years before he published his ideas about evolution. So that's what we're going to come to in the next video. Why did he eventually publish his thoughts? It's a good story. Stay tuned.